rolling. Hey guys, it's Dave, and I just wanted to put out this little video for you guys, just talk about a little bit about Pentecost. And this is what we're going to be studying tomorrow, as it is the anniversary of Pentecost. And so just a couple things to get a background of kind of where we're coming from and what we're doing, so that we can really spend tomorrow just really in a time of just worship and seeking the Lord together. So here's my thoughts on Pentecost, right? Now, depending on the date that you give, the first Pentecost that occurs in Acts chapter 2, there are several years out there that are given, but in my own reading, when you put together all the events that happen in the Gospels and you piece that together with what we know of history and the Roman Empire and all that, 33 AD seems to be the best fit. Like I said, this isn't concrete, and there are some other opinions. But like I said, for me and for our purpose, 33 AD seems to be the best fit for when the events in Acts chapter 2 actually took place. It's not something to be dogmatic about. But if that's the case, then that means tomorrow, when we come together on Pentecost, it's going to be 1986 years after that first Pentecost of the first church that we're going to read about in Acts chapter 2. Very cool, very cool. I dig on that. I just thought that was cool, something I would share with you guys. But what is Pentecost? Where does it come from? Why on Pentecost? Why was the church there? Why were all the Jews in Jerusalem at that time? Just a little bit of background, food for thought for you guys. First of all, it's the holiday is actually called, and pardon my pardon my Hebrew here, Shavuot. Shavuot is the actual name in the Hebrew of the holiday, but also for us in English, it's also known as the Harvest Festival or the Festival of Weeks. And this was a holiday celebrated by the Jews, and this comes from Exodus chapter 34 as well as Leviticus 23. Now, that was originally what it was. Later on, though, it was adopted into it. It was also called the Feast of Revelation, or simply acknowledging the anniversary of when the law was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. So there's two things going on here. It's a Jewish celebration of the feast, and also celebration and remembering the giving of the law or the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai. So very cool stuff. And it would happen 50 days after Passover, which is where that word Pentecost comes from, which means 50. So that's the significance of why it's called Pentecost, is because of those 50 days after Passover. So, but what about us now? What about us here in 21st century America, church gathering together here in the living room? What does this mean for us? Well, here's some things to think about. John the Baptist foretold this coming of this day of Pentecost in Mark chapter 1 and in Luke chapter 3. And he talked about that he was baptizing in water, but Jesus would be coming and he would be baptizing with the Holy Spirit. I particularly like Luke 3:16, when John the Baptist says he'd be baptizing not only in the Holy Spirit, but the Holy Spirit and fire. And we see this when we read Acts chapter 2. We see that fire reference showing up again as fulfilling the prophecy of what John the Baptist had said here. Also, Jesus mentioned several times that, yes, he was leaving, but he was going to be sending a helper. You can read about this in John chapter 14, John chapter 15, and then right before he ascended, he mentioned it again in Acts chapter 1, verse 5, that the helper is going to come. That they were to wait for that helper to come, and that helper did come on the day that we now call Pentecost. We read about in Acts chapter 2. Peter goes on to talk about those same events in Acts chapter 11, verse 16, when he's recalling, I believe he's in telling the church in Antioch the events that took place there on that day in Pentecost. You can read about that in Acts chapter 11. And now what's really cool is we get into the Gospels, the epistles, the letters to the churches. Paul makes a couple of really cool references. One in Galatians chapter 3, he talks about the promise of the Spirit there in Galatians 3:14. And again, same concept Paul is talking about in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. So this promise of the Spirit. So it wasn't just to be poured out on that one day, 1986 years ago, as some teach. But even Paul is referring to it later. And in these letters that are talking about being sent, and he's talking about that the Spirit is still available today. The Helper is still available today. The power and the promise of the Holy Spirit is still available for believers today. So that's kind of where we are with Pentecost. But here's a couple of thoughts I want to leave with you, something to think about, something I would like us to maybe talk about tomorrow as a group. First of all, this festival of harvest, or this harvest festival. Kind of cool that this day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit fell upon the believers, fell upon it on the day when these Jews were celebrating harvest. And yet remember Jesus in his words in Matthew 9 and Luke 10, when Jesus says that the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. It's interesting. I don't know if that's just a Dave thought or if those really tie in somehow together, but it's radical that the day the Jews were waiting for the Holy Spirit on the harvest festival time is when the Holy Spirit came and delivered us the power to go out and be able to fulfill this desire of Jesus for us to go out into the plentiful harvest and to reap these souls for the kingdom, right? And another thought too, as they were also celebrating the anniversary of God giving the law to Moses there on Mount Sinai. Here comes the Holy Spirit empowering the believers, the Christian believers. And I'm going to go here back to John chapter 13. I'm going to read verse 34 and 35, where Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So, we have this day when the Jews are celebrating the anniversary of God giving the law, the commandments to Moses for his people. And then on that same day, the new church is given the power of the Holy Spirit to fulfill the new commandment that Jesus has given, which is to love one another. Anyway, so just a couple of thoughts there on Pentecost. I look forward to hanging out with you all tomorrow in a time of just seeking the Lord and worshiping and fellowshipping together. A couple things, or actually one thing. Think about that. Think of the power of the Holy Spirit. Think of the power that came upon the church in Acts chapter 2. Think of all the great things we read about throughout the book of Acts. How the Spirit empowered the believers. Pick one or two of those events that are your favorite, that strike a chord in you somehow, that just blow you away in a way that even more than the other ones do. And let's share those. Let's share those things, and let's also come with a heart and mind prepared to wait upon the Lord and what the Lord has for us tomorrow. Anyways, I love you guys. I look forward to hanging out with everyone tomorrow, and we will see you tomorrow.